So go ahead.
I have a
Any
question.
questions for?
I have a question.
Sure.
And let me see. Would people prefer to see the video? I can do that. There. I just was eating lunch. So yeah, one of the things that would help me is if you use an example, like for instance, the Bridgepoint is coming up soon. How is that different? That's going to be this conditional use district zoning, I believe. So what can they do now that they couldn't have done a year ago?
So one other wrinkle to all of this is that right now, because we're doing virtual meetings, we're trying not to bring projects forward for special use permits because the state regulations for remote meetings make that very hard to do. So the Bridgepoint project, which is at Homestead and Weaver Dairy Extension, the northwest corner, is coming forward now as a conditional zoning, that second tool that Alisa was describing. They have a previous approval for that site from several years ago that was the first tool, conditional use district zoning. So they have an SUP and they got the site rezoned to R5 to support their density. They wanted to make some changes to their approved plans. So they were just going to modify that conditional use district and that special use permit, but now because we can't really effectively have hearings on special use permits, they're coming forward as a conditional zoning. So when they started under the first one, they had this idea for how to modify their project. They've switched to the second one, conditional zoning. That hasn't changed what they're proposing. Both processes accommodate the types of changes that they want to do. So there are differences between the two, and we'll talk about that more. But when it comes to what a developer can get built under one versus the other, these are both council reviews. There's room for discussion and careful review and consideration of impacts. So I don't know if that helps answer your question or if there's more to it.
So it's essentially the same. They can't do anything more or less than if this were going through as a regular SUP?
The densities and intensity, the amount of developable area is defined in our zoning districts. And getting a special use permit doesn't let you exceed what's in your zoning district. So whether you're linking your special use permit to a rezoning, which is conditional use district, or just doing a conditional zoning, your zoning district's going to set some maximums that the developer has to abide by in either case.
So let's just ask a couple more clarifying questions before we go further. Any others?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are SUPs still available?
Yes, but let me clarify one thing Corey said. Under conditional zoning, they may, in certain circumstances, exceed FAR, for example. Just so know, but that's a modification that can be done through conditional zoning. So now the SUP question, keep in mind that there are three separate and distinct tools: conditional use district zoning, which is the rezoning and the SUP, conditional zoning, and special uses. The town has used each separate tool for different things. So the special use permit still exists. So if it's a drive-through, it still is a special use, unless it's done as a conditional zoning. If it trips the threshold, the 2040 rule, it's a church and they disturb more than 20,000 square feet of, they build more than 20,000 square feet of building, it will be an SUP, even if it's permitted in the district. So what's difficult about this is that these three tools are separate and distinct. But the first one, conditional use district zoning, had that SUP component, which adds to the confusion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
It does. And I have
And-
one
Go
follow-up
ahead.
question, which is, is the conditional use defined by each town? The parameters of it and all the specifics, or is it a state issue?
So if you're talking about conditional zoning, then yes, the state gives us the tool, tells us the process, meaning it's legislative,
Mm-hmm.
but how we define that and use that can be different for different municipalities. Some municipalities, I'm sorry?
No, so I just wanted to say, so for example, the fact that Chapel Hill has arranged that using the conditional zoning, council members can meet individually with the developer to hammer out details privately. That is up to that's how the town chose to enforce it.
No.
No.
That is, because it is a legislative act and it is outside of the parameters and the constraints of a special use, which is quasi-judicial, that is why it allows community and stakeholder interaction with council. So it's not that we have defined that, it's because the state says special uses and conditional use districts are quasi-judicial and they are therefore constrained by, you have to give evidence and you have to be a witness, so your process is constrained. And then the state has said conditional zoning is legislative, so all stakeholders can take part. What I thought you were asking was, if Chapel Hill decides to say this use is conditional zoning and Pittsburgh decides to say it's not, we can do that.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one thing. I was at the environmental stewardship meeting last night and we reviewed 3 projects. And they were, I don't know if they were all conditional uses, frankly, but let's just take one. I think Bridgepoint is a conditional use now, right?
Mm-hmm.
The new one. So there was some stormwater issues and questions that I had going into that meeting. So I called up the staff people who had worked on that. And they were able to fill me in on kind of what they'd done and what their concerns were and why they did what they did or whatever. So I was so much better informed going into that advisory board meeting, but I'm not sure I could have done that under SUP. Am I correct?
The communication that's not allowed for an SUP review is between council members and any outside party. It's been our practice, if there's questions from the community for staff, that we are able to provide information. So I don't believe that there would be any change there.
But maybe it's just COVID and the virtual meetings that have changed things maybe a little bit too, right? I mean, in some ways you're less available, but in some ways you're more available. I mean, just like having this session. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, one of our largest constraints to meeting with people prior to COVID was finding a room. So
Well, this is a room right here. We're using Julie's room, right?
that's right.
Right. Okay, any other clarifications, questions so far? So we've got 3 different kinds of tools. We've got conditional use married to SUP, which is the way we used to do things. We have conditional zoning, which we're doing a lot of nowadays. And then we still have the SUP. And under what circumstances would you still be using that SUP?
So for example, if you had a drive-through in the community commercial district and you were not pursuing some other kind of tool, that's a special use. Core gas stations, what else?
Gas stations, self-storage, large places of assembly, things where you need to really consider the impacts particulars of that site and its surroundings. The more unusual uses are special uses.
We also have development agreements. So
I'm sorry?
the fourth one, we have development agreements.
Yes, that is another tool.
Right.
Different beast, but yeah.
But again, a development agreement is a legislative tool, which
Mhm.
frees it from the constraint of the special use permit.
Right.
The other time we have special use is the 2040 rule. So if you build a building that's more than 20,000 square feet, or you disturb more than 40,000 square feet of land, even if the use is permitted, so even if it's a grocery store in the community commercial district, if you trip those thresholds, it becomes a special use. So those are the two instances where we would continue to have special uses in the town.
Can you think of an example of one we've got going now?
That's tripped the 2040 rule.
Yeah, that's an SUP.
Christ Community Church, isn't it?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, right now that project is moving forward. It's one of the only SUPs we have moving forward, which is more to do with the limitations we have in virtual meetings. But that's a church at the corner of Old Oxford and Irwin, where it's proposed. They do need an SUP because they have more than 40,000 square feet of land disturbance. They do not need a change to their zoning district. And to me, that's an important distinction. If someone wants to build a project on a site and the zoning supports their project in terms of the allowable density, height, and all of that, then, well, especially density and uses, then SUP could be a good tool. It's not necessarily the only tool, but it could be a good tool for that developer, because they don't need to change their zoning. If they do need to change their zoning, the traditional path for many years has been that conditional use district zoning, which is now going away. So we're more likely to see conditional zoning in those cases. We looked at data from the past 15 years, and there's a pretty good split between SUPs linked to rezoning and SUPs that went forward as standalone. For those reasons Alisa mentioned, it's a special use, such as a drive-through, or it's tripping the 20,000 or 40,000 square foot thresholds. In fact, that situation of just the standalone SUP was a little more frequent than an SUP with a rezoning. So we imagine, based on that, SUP will still be a tool used fairly regularly.
Bridgepoint doesn't fall under the 2040 rule?
Bridgepoint does exceed those thresholds. It's going for as a conditional zoning, so you can use conditional zoning to address the 2040 rule. And you know, it's a council decision, so it's you know, it's still giving consideration to whether the project, the impacts of the project that is at that scale.
So the 2040 rule then isn't a, doesn't
It
create
can be addressed by either
inability.
conditional zoning or use permit.
Repeat that again, Corey.
The 2040 rule, going over 20,000 square feet of building or 40,000 square feet of land disturbance, that can be allowed through conditional zoning. That can also be allowed through a special use permit. That's kind of an either or.
Charles Humble's just joined on. Hi, Charles. Sorry you had trouble getting on.
My bad. I'm sure.
Yeah,
Sorry to miss all that at the beginning. I'll ask somebody to catch me up later offline.
Yeah, we're talking right now under what we have three tools now. Actually, we have the development agreement, which is yet another, but because of the state legislature, and again, Corey and Alyssa will correct me, we've got three tools now to use. One is the conditional use married to the SUP, and that's going away, isn't it? That one?
That's the one that's going away. And
that's going away. So that's the way we used to do stuff. Yeah. And then now we have a new thing called conditional zoning, which you've heard of, Charles. and it's a legislative process. And it can vary according to what jurisdictions want to do with it, but it allows, you know, the council to go out for coffee and everybody to talk to each other and so on. And then there's still circumstances where the SUP is used, and that's what we were just discussing. When there's a drive-in, when they're in a commercial use area, gas stations, self-storage. The 2040 rule, if you would just explain that one more time, what the 2040 rule is.
Yeah, that's the part I don't understand.
Well, the ordinance states that that there is this threshold around a project that's 20,000 square feet of building,
Right.
or 40,000 square feet of land disturbance, or both. If you're exceeding that threshold, then as it's structured now, you need to either get a special use permit or a conditional zoning.
Okay. So it's just merely that you do still have the option of using an SUP under the 2040 rule, if you want. But a
Yeah.
lot of people are choosing the conditional use, right? And of course, under COVID times, as you explained, you're not allowed to have virtual meetings with the SUP, basically, right?
No, you can. I heard Pam swearing somebody in.
Oh,
Yeah.
You can, but it's we are advising applicants with any sizable project against doing that, because there's room for challenge the way the state is adding regulations. So I meant, you know, you may have heard that happening for the Christ Community Church project, which compared to some of the others coming forward for consideration is a smaller project.
So maybe we need to take a step back for just a second. So if you could imagine in your head, or if necessary, I can call it up, the use table that's in the LUMO, right? And it says single family home, R1P, drive-through, you know, C or S for special use permit. Dwellings more than a bank in the community commercial district, P. So what that P means is that it can move forward as a site plan, meaning approved by the Planning Commission, unless it trips the 2040 rule. So the use may in and of itself be permitted by that chart, but because it trips one of those thresholds or both of them, it either can take the SUP route, or as Corey said, if they need a rezoning, they are automatically going to, from now forward, choose conditional zoning. In some cases, they are going ahead and choosing the conditional zoning, even if they don't need a rezoning. So that adds another level of complexity to this whole concept.
that's a very clear explanation. Thank you, Alisa.
Okay.
Any follow-ups to that? Questions? Okay, why don't you continue then? Oh, did I miss a question? Okay, go ahead.
So we have to make the conversion from conditional use district zoning to conditional zoning for existing projects by the end of the year. But we have to completely eliminate it from the LUMO by June 30th of next year. So what Corey and I have been doing, we started back in June when we met with y'all then, and then what we're doing tomorrow night is asking council to move through some of the topics that are particularly relevant to Chapel Hill as a result of this legislation. The other things that are in the legislation are, we have to include certain definitions. So we'll put them in. We have to change reference numbers. So we'll do it. I mean, all of those are very black and white, non-policy implication kinds of decisions. And so if you've had an opportunity to look at the staff report for tomorrow night, what's in front of the work session are just these larger topics. So that's how we're approaching this, is we're asking council to weigh in on these. We'll continue doing that in October, and we'll move forward in the spring and start looking at some actual language. I will say to you that on the 30th, there are some amendments coming forward that are necessitated by the state legislation. Like, for example, we don't have conditional zoning districts for every single solitary conditional use district that we have, so we can't convert. So if we don't create them and the tool goes away by the end of, that our conversion has to be done by the end of the year, these projects will be unzoned. They'll have no way to be for us to regulate them. So there are some amendments moving forward before next year, public hearing being held on the 30th. And I wanted you just to be aware of that. I didn't want you to think that we were not doing anything right now. We have got to deal with that so that it's moving forward at the end of the month. Corey, what else do we need to say to lay the groundwork for this conversation?
I mean, the headline change has to do with conditional use district zoning going away. And as Alisa said, we need to prepare LUMO to let future projects still have a path for consideration, conditional zoning. And with our map needing to change to convert those existing districts. That's what we're prepping for this fall. And I mean, there's a lot of smaller potatoes topics in the new legislation. Alisa, I didn't know if there's others we wanted to highlight today or just kind of stick to, it could be a lot just to wrap our heads around this distinction between conditional use district zoning and conditional zoning.
Dale, you had a question.
How does using the conditional use permit not result in spot zoning?
How does conditional zoning not result in spot zoning? Okay, yeah, so keep in mind when you say conditional use permit, many people—
I'm sorry.
Yeah, conditional zoning. So conditional in and of itself, people have the misconception that all spot zoning is bad, which is not true. You have to look at what the particulars are for each individual site to determine whether or not the zoning being requested is appropriate. And in that sense, conditional zoning and conditional use district zoning would potentially have a spot zoning effect is exactly the same. Because conditional use district zoning had a rezoning attached to it. You could not get a special use permit if you didn't rezone the land. So in that way, the two tools are exactly the same, right? Because you are rezoning. But in and of itself, spot zoning is not bad. It is, you have to look at each individual site, look at the comp plan, look at what's being proposed, and decide whether or not it is appropriate given your land use tools and your community's vision for itself.
Does that answer your question, Dale?
Well, it answers my question. I would just make the point that if you were applying for an SUP and you had to rezone the land, you have that predictability. Whereas right now, if there's a piece of land that comes in for conditional use, it could end up being anything. There is no predictability.
The predictability is exactly the same under both scenarios, because the rezoning, whether it's conditional use district zoning or conditional zoning, rezones it to a district, and then either through the legislative act of conditional zoning or the SUP defines what uses can go there.
I understand. I understand that, but I just have a different take on it. I think that when you're looking at a land use map and you're saying, well, this area won't be commercial, and then all of a sudden a conditional use comes in, it's different. It's a different process, and the requirements for an SUP, I think, are more intense. So it would make it harder to get that rezoning with an SUP.
So keep in mind that our transactional nature of our code, the way we have traditionally done development, whether it's conditional use district zoning or conditional zoning, is what gives us the lack of predictability. Because our land use plan or our future land use map that's in Chapel Hill 2020 should define what we think the future holds. And that gives us predictability. But right now, whether you're doing conditional use district zoning or conditional zoning, anybody and his brother can come in and ask, and even if we had a good future land use map, anybody and his brother can come in and ask for a rezoning. But because our land use plan is not reflective of what our community's vision is, you can't pull that land use plan up and have an idea of where we're going to be 30 years from now. Hopefully, when we adopt the new one, that will not be the case. But nonetheless, the lack of predictability comes from the transactional nature of our development review. And then in terms of the stringency, the 4 findings, believe it or not, are actually fairly easy to meet. So it's actually easier for council to turn down a conditional zoning because it's completely discretionary.
We might want to just pause on that point a bit. Dell, did you have something more to say?
Well, I just wanted to confirm that what you're saying is then when the flume is adopted with the future land use maps, that will give us more predictability because the way it's set up will provide that vision into the future.
That is the ultimate goal, Nell. Now, I'll be honest with you. That is the ultimate, one of the 3 goals for that project. One of them was predictability. And so that is the whole reason behind
So it's not it's not aspirational or something like that.
Well,
I said the future land use map is not aspirational.
Now, some council members think it's aspirational. We've been told that.
I mean, it is definitely aspirational. Whereas if you today, you hold up our land use plan from Chapel Hill 2020 and our existing land use map, they are overlaid them. They are almost the exact same document, believe it or not.
But we're talking about the future land use maps, not the one in 2020.
But the future land use map really is much more aspirational, but hopefully will gives us more predictability because we didn't take the land use plan and the existing land use map and lay it on top of each other and create the map. We actually thought about where we want to be 30 years from now.
And it might be worth pointing out when we get a new future land use map, there's then different approaches to take for what we do with our zoning map.
Correct.
And what we've had is zoning that really takes place on a case-by-case basis led by the property owner in most situations. And we may keep doing that unless council wants to think about changes to zoning that bring it more in line with the future land use map. You know, how do you get the zoning map from today to that future? Could be done in different ways, whether it's more piece by piece, developer driven, or wholesale, community driven.
Thanks, Corey.
This is a pretty interesting conversation for those of us who have followed Chapel Hill development for years and tangled with a special use for so many years. I mean, I was on the council, you know, and that was the major thing, was marrying those two, the conditional district zoning and the SUP, and the 4 findings I always felt really were protective. And granted, there were most projects were approved that were brought to the council by the staff, but occasionally there was one that was turned down, and it was done so because it didn't meet the 4 findings. And then occasionally citizens would sue and say, you say that met the 4 findings, but it didn't. And occasionally citizens would win. So it's, I don't know. Some of us were rather like that. We kind of felt that the citizens had more of a voice with the special use, but maybe it really didn't exist. I don't know.
You will have a much louder, more persuasive voice under conditional zoning, because when you stand up there to give, you don't have to stand up there and be sworn in and be an expert and give witness. You can stand up there at the public hearing and say, I don't like this for X. And you don't have to be a witness, an expert in X. You can just stand up there.
So maybe it would be good to just list off some of the changes that we see then with conditional zoning. So that's one, that's important one. Maybe just list some of the other things that will happen as a result of this process. Don't have to be an expert, I like that.
You don't have to be.
Yeah. Then the council doesn't need to worry, be cautioned by the town attorney to not, once the application has been filed, that they should not have private conversations with anyone. So they can have private conversations with Roger Perry or anybody, and as any citizen group, right?
Correct.
And then they don't have to report that, do they?
Correct. They may choose to, but they don't have to.
Okay. What other changes do you think of?
It will still go through the development review process in terms of all the boards. That's completely the same.
There's still a public hearing or a council hearing at the end. So whether there's been communication previously or not, not all the decision-making is going to be based, the decision-making is not going to be based off of conversations outside the council chamber. There is that public meeting for the consideration of the actual project.
But practically speaking, the assumption is, and we've been told this by council members, that the problems or the objections would have, been discussed and worked out and come to some resolution. And it almost seems like the public hearing is an afterthought because it's a given that it will be approved since they've worked it out. For the most part. I mean, I realize that sometimes you could not work it out, but in as much as council wants to work these things out and be open to business, my assumption is that they would try their best.
What's your observation, Corey and Alisa, on the process, how it affects the process before it ever gets to the council? I keep learning more and more about this, but development application comes and there's a concept plan and so on and so forth. And if they go ahead and they apply, and then there's all these applications that the developer has to do, and there's negotiations that go on with staff. So how do you see that part of it changing, if at all?
I don't see that changing much, but I should point out there were two parts to the session law that created 160D. And part one, which is in effect now, places severe limitations on the conditions that council can place on a special use permit.
Oh my goodness, okay.
So we looked at some old special use permits, and several of the conditions that were placed on them would not be permissible under law now. So the benefit to conditional zoning is that we can place conditions such as, an in lieu fee for affordable housing or some sort of stormwater facility or whatever else under conditional zoning. If the property owner and the applicant agree in writing, we can do that with conditional zoning now, and we cannot do it with SUPs. And that's also a part of this legislation. And I think we had this conversation, started this conversation back in June.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. Although, yeah.
So the one, the other advantage to conditional zoning, if you want to phrase it that way, is if it's in a particular part of town that has a particular part of need for a particular community benefit, and the applicant and the property owner are willing to do that, then the approval
But
can.
isn't that if kind of a showstopper? I mean, the developer could just say, well, I don't want to do that.
And then the council can just not approve it. I mean, it's
Exactly. So that's the lever that the council has.
it's
And they have to be willing to use it. Yeah.
And that ties back into SUPs being decided based on the 4 findings of fact, and conditional zoning offering more discretion to council in the decision making. So, you know, we hear this change happening for the types of conditions that can be on an SUP versus conditional zoning. And you may say, what does this General Assembly have against SUPs? Well, they're looking at the way SUPs get reviewed and acted on with the quasi-judicial process, with the findings of fact. And they're saying, okay, what types of conditions help, you know, determine whether the findings of facts are being met versus any types of conditions that the community and council may want to see. I mean, that, at least, is that a good way to state why there's that change in the types of conditions?
That is definitely. I mean, part of the reason this law was passed is, you know, the people who drafted it looked around the state and said, what are municipalities doing wrong, and what can we help them with? And so they really were looking at a way to keep us out of trouble, and helping us make sure that we are having appropriate quasi-judicial evidence.
But you mean it wasn't a right-wing conspiracy in General Assembly that brought this around?
No. So the Part 2 portion of it that got rid of conditional use district zoning and all of that really was an 8-year bipartisan effort that was predominantly drafted by planners and land use attorneys throughout the state. And so that's why it was really meant to be just a cleanup effort and a modernization. Now, the Part 1 of the law was a different story. It was drafted by a different organization, but Part 2 really was just that modernization effort.
Who drafted Part 1?
The Home Builders Association.
Who?
The Home Builders Association.
Oh, geez. Okay.
So what specific conditions are no longer allowed to be placed on an SUP?
So we cannot exceed our basic zoning authority as it is given to us by the state of North Carolina. So we are a Dillon's Rule state, which means that we can only regulate development as they tell us we can. So we can regulate use, we can regulate placement on the lot, we can regulate height, we can regulate density. They allow us to have some recreation fees. They tell us how we can how we can regulate curb cuts. They do all of these things that they specifically said we can regulate.
Stormwater,
Yeah.
things that we do often, many things we do often, but not all things that we do often are in there.
So those are the things we can put on SUP. What falls in a gray area is affordable housing. What's pretty much out of luck is the in lieu fee.
Is the what?
In lieu fee for affordable housing, because that is not specifically given to us as a.
I didn't understand you. It didn't come through clearly. Sorry.
The in lieu fee, the affordable housing in lieu fee. We cannot. Am I getting feedback?
There's an echo.
Yeah, there's an echo. What is in lieu fee?
In lieu.
Oh, in lieu.
Yeah.
All right, got it. You had it. I thought it was exotic new process I've never heard of.
So many of the things that we have traditionally done as a part of SUPs are not going to be permissible. So green building features, EV charging stations, all of those things that we have traditionally put on SUPs, we cannot put moving forward.
But you can sounds like what you're saying is you can put them in a special agreement, a side agreement that the council and the developer make. And then if does that authority carry through if you resell the property?
So you can only do it as a part of conditional zoning.
Right. So you're not doing the SUP. If you had an SUP and you said there was affordable housing the SUP would say what the maximum you could build is, the maximum conditions on it. And so then if you had an SUP, a parcel with an SUP on it, and then you sold it to somebody new, and it had an affordable housing condition in it, under this new law that you're talking about, the changes made in 160D, that side agreement that the developer has made with the council, does that carry through to the new buyer, the new property owner? Or is that only between the original developer and the council?
So let's separate this for a second. For
Okay.
conditional zoning, you can place those conditions that exceed our basic zoning authority, the ones we just listed, affordable housing, green building, blah, blah, blah. That carries through to the original property owner and any subsequent property owner. If you have a SUP, if you put a drive-through today at 1320 MLK, and we put a condition on it that says the drive-through has to be X feet from the entrance, that's an enforceable condition, and it runs with the land, no matter who owns it. But the key is we can only put conditions that we are expressly permitted by the state of North Carolina to put on an SUP. Anything beyond that has to be a conditional zoning, and it has to be assigned and agreed to by the property owner and the applicant. Does that make sense?
And so then it does carry through. So for instance, the wood property, if that had been the 2217 homestead, if that had been a side agreement like you're talking about with the new ones that you would have to make under 160D and that. So then it was made with a particular developer and the council, and then it gets sold. So then that affordable housing piece, which is what I'm interested in, that would carry through to whoever owns it. If this would have been done under the 160D.
I would think things would run with the permit, wouldn't they?
No, they run with land, generally.
Run with the land. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's not a side agreement. For
It's not
conditional
a side
zoning,
agreement. Yeah, that's not correct.
it is a condition of the approval that is recorded with the county and runs with the land. So it is a condition of approval that runs with the land. It is not a side agreement. And I don't know how the wood property was entitled, whether it was a conditional use district zone or whatever it was.
It was changed to rezone to R5C. So it had the condition on it. And all those things that were the SUP became the condition.
Okay, so we've listed off a number of things for the conditional zoning. Did we basically capture everything, how it's different, how it works?
For that, I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions from folks? Oh,
So
thanks.
can you do payment in lieu? Did you just say earlier that under this new 160D, the council can't accept a payment in lieu that would be legally enforceable?
So under part 1, if it's a part of a special use permit, we have been advised that an in lieu fee as a condition of a special use permit for affordable housing would be difficult to do. If they do it under conditional zoning, which has existed in the state of North Carolina since 2005, so it's not a 160D thing. It's been expressly authorized in North Carolina since 2005. You can put things beyond, conditions beyond our traditional zoning authority, including in lieu fee for affordable housing,
Okay.
if it's conditional zoning.
Okay, so the bridge point that's coming through in the next couple of weeks, they can't, right now they're offering units. If they were to change that to payment in lieu, council should have its red flags up because that would not be acceptable. Is that correct?
So they're bringing forward their project as a conditional zoning,
Okay.
which is the one that does allow conditions beyond their basic zoning authority. So whether they do the units on site or payment in lieu, they're on a better track from the town's perspective to make that work out. And I would add that we have seen with the special use permits and conditional use district zoning, we have seen challenges to affordable housing conditions before this law even passed. We've seen, for example, when the property is sold and a new developer comes in and they say, I don't think this should be required. We've had legal actions that result in refunding of payments in lieu that we received. So this is not coming out of left field to us. And it's good to get affirmation that conditional zoning is still a possible path to seek affordable housing, because special use permits have been a little creaky in that area for a while now.
So if Evolve had gone through as a conditional zoning, they would have had a really hard time suing to get their money, the affordable housing money back, when they sold it, after they sold it.
Based on what we're understanding, you know, I don't want to try to think through the what ifs and know what arguments lawyers could have brought forward. But yes, the Evolve project or Charterwood at MLK, just south of Weaver Dairy Extension, yes, they did get their, I think that fee got all refunded. And they did have a special use permit and challenge that condition.
Okay.
And again, I don't want to play what if either, but in that particular case, as I understand it, it was tied to the SUP as opposed to being tied to the rezoning, which we have done most recently when it was conditional use district zoning, to try to circumvent this situation, right? So, you know, if they go conditional zoning, the circumventing doesn't have to happen.
Okay. So any other questions? I've got one more. So let me, wait a minute, it's gone out of my head. Okay, so getting to the problem that that you've cited, Corey, about there's problems, the legal authorities at the state see problems with going ahead with SUPs in a virtual meeting. And given that virtual meetings look like they're going to go ahead right all fall, am I right? Okay, so given that, what's happening? Just give us the overview of all the development projects that are out there that people are putting together and starting and considering applying. What impact can we expect then? And what are you telling the council about what's happening on this?
So, I mean, there is kind of this interesting convergence between what's going on now with virtual meetings, making it very challenging to do SUP review, and then within the year when we won't have conditional use district zoning that includes SUPs. So Alisa was talking about those, the proposed changes coming to council on September 30th, which in a way address both things, the current limitations and 160D. So Alisa, I don't know what we would want to say then about what that is setting the stage for with upcoming development.
I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the only two projects that are moving forward in an SUP format outside of the historic district, outside of that quasi-judicial situation, is Christ Community and a modification to Caraway.
Yeah.
So either the applicants have chosen to just hold off, or they're switching to conditional zoning so that they can move forward in a legislative format. I don't think there's anybody we don't have any other special use permits that we need to worry, that we're worrying about in the fall.
Yeah, we've got those two that for very particular reasons have stayed on the special use permit track. And then others, we're seeing if we can make accommodation for them in LUMO to allow them as conditional zoning reviews. That includes Bridgepoint didn't have any challenges in LUMO as it currently exists to convert to conditional zoning. So they're doing that. There'll be the 1200 MLK project, which is the Tar Heel Mobile Home Park and the old Marathon gas station, that site. Again, if depending, you know, council's going to consider some changes on the 30th, which could support that project coming forward as conditional zoning. Columbia Street Annex, which is at where Columbia Street crosses 54, across from Merritt's. That one is in the same boat, likely turning into conditional zoning.
Well, is there on the annex? I attended the meeting on that last night on the Environmental Stewardship Board, and a key question is whether or not the stream that runs through the property is going to be it was designated perennial, and the developer is questioning that, and is there's a proper form that they do that with, right? So who is going to judge about that? Who's going to make the final call on that? Is that going to be the planning department, or is it the town manager?
I'm not familiar with the specifics of the stream determination.
Well, just so you know, the most recent stream determination said it's perennial, and the developer announced to us last night that if that is upheld, and that was a determination done by a staff member in Chapel Hill, that they can't move forward with their plan, period. So it's kind of important. So I'm just curious about what the process is and when we'll hear the rest, you know, what happens next.
All right, and we can try and get that information on its review schedule if you want to follow up by email, maybe.
Okay, I'll do that. And then the other specifics is the municipal services building. There's a concept plan review for that coming up today, I think, right?
There's a public meeting, I think, this evening, public information meeting on the Municipal Service Center, and then it'll be reviewed by the CDC and by council in the weeks ahead, and that is a concept plan.
And that is for the property that's where the fire station is now?
Yeah, the fire station actually just north of the Evolve Charterwood site at Weaver Dairy Extension and MLK.
Did you have any follow-ups on that, Dale?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about it.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I'm right behind it, so yes, I have a lot of thoughts about it.
Well, I just didn't know if you had any questions about the process or anything.
Well, I just find it a very odd siting for municipal services building when everything that is west of MLK is residential, except for the fire station, which always was going to be redeveloped. And I could understand that if somebody wanted to put affordable housing there, that's residential. But I don't see how you get a big building with lots of incoming traffic surrounded by homes. So that's just one.
So the public information meeting is at 5:15 on that project, and I'm sure people facilitating that meeting will know more about the background of that proposal more than I know. And at the concept plan stage, we're looking at traffic at a high level. There would be along the way with formal review of the project in the months ahead, traffic impact study.
And I assume the council must have bought off on this location, right? Or said they kind of liked it or something, because the police station fell in on Estes Drive extension. It fell in at the mall. So somebody must have decided something.
It's not a police station.
Oh.
It's administrative offices for the police.
Yeah. Sounds like a police station.
I don't know what that means. That will be one of my questions.
Okay. All right. Any last questions? We'll wrap it up, and we really appreciate the time that you spent, Alisa and Corey, with us. Thank you. It's really been helpful. Any other last question?
One broad question. So for those of us who are really interested in affordable housing, what's the best zoning or what's the best path to go through to make sure that it can't be reversed?
Conditional zoning.
Conditional zoning. Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really, it's a complicated series of changes that we're looking at. So it's really helpful for you to help us understand it better. So thank you.
Not a problem.
All right.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for everybody for attending. All
Good night.
right.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.